One of the things that I grew up with that I found out later was not ordinary at all was I grew up in a home where my father saw his in-laws, my mother's parents, as his parents. My dad grew up an orphan. I've shared that with you before. So when he met my mother and at college, and they traveled back to her home, and she introduced him to her parents, my dad immediately had a connection with them. And I heard them tell about that connection. He became the son they never had. My mom was 7 years older than her sister. And in between that time, my grandmother did give birth to a son. He only lived a few hours. And that was their son. So when my dad came into my mother's life, they saw him as their son. They referred to him as their son. My dad, I never heard my dad referred to in-laws. It was always mom and dad and mom. And I didn't realize how unusual that was until until later on in life. And when I met my wife's parents, I started doing exactly what my dad did. I referred to them as dad and mom. And the rest of the family says, well, wait a minute. And they questioned this because it was so not ordinary. And I found myself, having to explain that multiple times, especially when they both died. And I did those services, and people said, well, they weren't your parents, were they? No, but I knew them as mom and dad. And I referred to them that way, and I loved them that way. And I saw my dad love my mother's parents and them love him as their son. And it was an incredible experience. And that's part of what speaks into my experience when I talk about family. And that's why I keep coming back to a foundational statement that was a part of every family for the Hebrew people from the time that Moses presented the law to them, presented a structure for worship to them. From that very beginning, they used the Shema. And as I explained last week, that was what kids learned. They didn't have numbers. They didn't have letters. There was no alphabet. They learned the Shema. And that was what they started speaking and doing and teaching. That became the foundation of everything. So I'm inviting you this morning. Can we say it together? It's on the screen. Last week I gave it to you on a card, but this week let's just read it off the screen. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. That statement was infused. It was woven into the very fabric of life for the Hebrew people. All through the Old Testament. And Orthodox Jews today, people who worship God under the Judaic system, they still use the Shema. And that's the basis of everything for their lives. And part of that foundation then becomes the fifth commandment, which is this: Hear, honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. And we defined honor. And we keep coming back to this. Honor your father and your mother. Oh, the next slide, please. Honor is being thankful and appreciative for the privilege of being associated with or receiving favor from a respected person. Now, I got pushback on this last week, okay? I got pushback because people said, well, I was abused. My relationship with my parents is not one that I would honor. And my reply is this. Number one, make sure that your heart is not full of bitterness, because we have a responsibility to forgive. Even if a relationship is not restored, there's still a responsibility on our part to forgive. It is not biblical or Christ-like to say that I can never forgive that person. God would never expect me to forgive that person. That is not biblical. Go read Matthew chapter 18, the story of the unforgiving servant, and read Jesus' statement at the end of that story, where he says this. The statement that Jesus makes is, if you can't forgive your brother or your sister from your heart, don't expect God to forgive you. That's a scary statement. If you can't forgive your brother or your sister from your heart, don't expect God to forgive you. That's scary, my friends. And that puts us in a position where we have to learn how to forgive. Now, does that mean the relationship is restored? No. So the second part of my answer to people who say, I just don't honor or respect my birth father or my birth mother or my stepfather or my stepmother, whatever it might be, I say, but there is some adult that influenced you that you do respect. Maybe it's a grandparent. Maybe it's an aunt or an uncle. Somebody that was in authority, in a place of influence in your life when you were a child, when you were a teenager, that you can show honor to. And that is our responsibility. So I'm not dismissing this. I'm not saying, no, you have to honor the people who abused you. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm saying, first of all, make sure you forgive. And second of all, find the people who influenced you, who took care of you, who taught you, who mentored you, and honor them. One of the things that my dad shared often was, for him, that was 2 school teachers that he had in high school. And I remember meeting those women as a kid and being introduced to them because they had a tremendous influence over his life, and he honored them. So this morning, we tackle a subject that we have to address in order for us to understand family, and in order for us to talk about no ordinary family, and that is marriage. And I do that under the title "Fit to be Tied," because there is a sense where when we enter into a marriage, we're tying ourselves to that person. Now, I want to make sure that everybody understands something. In weeks to come, we're going to talk about being single. We're going to talk about choosing to be single. We're going to talk about being single again. We're going to address the subject of divorce and remarriage. Those are all a part of our fabric of life, and they deserve to be addressed. But we have to start someplace. And I'm starting this morning with talking about marriage and the function of marriage and how that looks. So just please don't turn off the volume. Don't close your ears. Don't say, oh, this doesn't apply to me. No, it applies to all of us, whether we're in any of the categories of not yet married, single, choosing to be single, divorced, remarried, having lost a spouse and widowed. There are all kinds of classifications here, but we have to start someplace. So we start with the whole concept that God came up with. This is His idea. This is His idea. Because He is the one who created mankind, human beings. When you read mankind, sometimes we get so focused on the word man that we don't understand that is everyone. So I always put human beings in parentheses here. That's not in the text. So God created human beings in His own image. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. So now I come to another place where I have to do a footnote, a parenthesis, and explain something, and that is this. And we need to get this. This is really important, friends. So please hear me. Look up at me, please. This is really important. we have to understand that same-sex attraction, and gender dysphoria are real. They're real. We cannot ignore them. We cannot dismiss them. However, we have to approach them with grace and compassion. If we dismiss those people, if we categorize those people in a way that we want to ignore them, if we dismiss them and put them down, if we use derogatory language and words about them, we are not showing grace and compassion. We're not loving one another the way Jesus loves us. So this is the challenge. This is our challenge, my challenge, your challenge. We must learn to accept those people without affirming their behavior. I'll say that again. We have to accept those people without affirming their behavior. Now, culturally, we have a situation where people say to us, well, if you accept me, you have to affirm everything I do. You have to accept all of me. No, we don't. I'd like to know where the switch gets flipped, because we don't do that with little kids. You know, we accept and love our kids, but if they run out in the street after a baseball, we stop them. And we don't say, oh, that was a good thing to do. Go get the ball. Run out in front of that car. They'll probably stop for you. We don't do that. But there's somehow the switch gets flipped at some point, and we stop treating people that way and approaching people that way and being that open and honest with people. And we think, well, if we accept them, then that means I accept everything they do and I affirm everything they do. No, it doesn't. And as Jesus followers, we need to be very clear on this. And I have said this before from this platform, and I will say it again, and you can replay the video all you want. People who are dealing with same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria are as welcome in this place and in this church. They're just as welcome as those of you who struggle with gossip and tax evasion and lust. Just as welcome. They're just as welcome as those of you who are jealous and who have a hard time telling the truth. They're just as welcome. And we have to be open and willing to embrace the people that Jesus would embrace. Because in so many ways, they would be the tax collectors and the prostitutes that the religious leaders had such a hard time that Jesus associated with them. Jesus would not ignore them. And Jesus would not stick his finger in their face and say, you're going to hell. And some of us are guilty of doing that. We have to stop it. We have to learn how to accept people without affirming their behavior. So, we go back. God created human beings. He created them in His own image. He created them male and female. And then God said, it's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him. And He did this, and the text in Genesis, you can go back and read it in Genesis chapter 2. He brought all the creatures that He'd created before the man, and the man named all these creatures. And not a suitable helper was found for Adam in that process. So this is what God did. So the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was sleeping, He took one of the man's ribs and then closed up the place with flesh. And then God made a woman from the rib He had taken out of the man, and He brought her to the man. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. That's the picture that God paints for us. That's the story that Moses relates to the people. That is what is taught from the very beginning of creation of how God put men and women in relationship to each other. And I want you to notice a few things, would you please? He did not take from the man's foot so that man stomps on women. He didn't. And anyone who looks at the relationship in that way is in error. And believe me, that was one of the things that happened in the Old Testament, especially, that still exists in many countries today where women have no rights, where women are second-class citizens. I mean, even the people of Israel in Jesus' day, a woman could not testify in a court because her testimony was not considered reliable. A woman could not own property. A woman had no rights. She had to have a brother, a husband, an uncle, a father, someone to speak for her, someone to do business in her name or in their name on her behalf. It was terrible. Jesus did more to lift women up in our culture than any other single person in history. The fact that women are recorded as the first people to arrive at the tomb is amazing, because their testimony would not have been considered valid, and yet they appear in all four of the Gospels, giving an account of the resurrection of Jesus. So, God doesn't take a bone or flesh out of a man's head so that he can rule over the woman. That just isn't the way it works. That's why when Paul, and we will get to this passage in Ephesians later on, that's why Paul, when he writes what he does to husbands and wives in the book of Ephesians, the whole section starts out with husbands and wives submit to one another in love out of reverence for Christ. Submit to one another. It's not one person is in charge of the other person. That's not what Scripture says. And anyone who misinterprets that is in error. And we cannot fall into that trap. I mean, Jesus recognizes this when he says, and Matthew records these words. And remember, what Matthew records for us is Peter's account of what Jesus said. Matthew wasn't there. Matthew is writing this down because he's hearing this from Peter. Haven't you read, Jesus said, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Jesus says, don't you understand this? Can you see this? And he goes all the way back to Genesis 2, all the way back to what Moses had recorded for them, all the way back to what they'd been hearing and learning from the very beginning. And therefore, we get out of that, we get a definition of marriage. And you should have received a card that has this definition on it, because this is really important, folks, especially in our day and age. It's important that you have a definition of marriage. This is not my definition. This is the definition that our church holds to, our denomination holds to, that the National Association of Evangelical holds to. This is the definition that we believe about marriage. Marriage is a lifelong commitment to a covenant relationship. Covenant is not a contract. A covenant relationship between one man and one woman entered into with God and before witnesses. That's what a marriage is. It's a lifelong commitment to a covenant relationship between one man and one woman entered into with God and before witnesses. Again, it is not a contract. It's not a 50-50 relationship. No one should be keeping score. Well, you gave in last time, so I'm going to give in this time. There's no contract. There's no 50-50 division of responsibilities. So I just want to be really practical for the next couple minutes and march through what this looks like. Okay? Number one, and these are not in any order, It's just the order that I wrote them down in. It takes 100% commitment on both people's part. Like I said, it's not 50-50. It takes 100%. It means that a couple, when they enter into marriage, they agree together on what the goal of that marriage is, and they agree that nothing will stand in the way of accomplishing that goal. Nothing. So that makes compromise possible, because the next thing that I think of when I think about marriage relationships is you're going to have to figure out how to fight. Because anytime you put two people together from two different backgrounds, from two different homes, with two different ideas and two different sets of dreams, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be disagreement, and you got to figure out how to fight. You got to figure it out. And a lot of times when I'm talking to couples, it means you have to choose the time and the place. Most of the time, when there's a disagreement, when there's an argument, when there's conflict, it's not the right time to tackle that issue right now. Rarely does that happen. In fact, what should happen most of the time is you should say, okay, we disagree on this one. After the kids go to bed at 9 o'clock tonight, can we sit down and talk this through? Or breakfast tomorrow morning after the kids go to school. We have to talk this through. Because doing it in the moment, man, that brings up all my anger, all my frustration. I can get historical, and all of you know what that means. I can use words like never and always, and you should always avoid using the word never and never use the word always. Because those are pejorative terms. Those are argumentative terms. And when we do that, we just invite more conflict into what is already a disagreeable situation. And that means that if we're going to do that, if we're going to have to figure that out, it means we also have to figure out conflict resolution. We've got to figure out conflict resolution. We got to figure out how do we come to some kind of agreement, even if it's an agreement to disagree. Because we have to learn how to resolve conflict. None of us want to live in continual conflict. We want to get some kind of resolution. And sometimes that means we have to manage the conflict. Because tension is not always bad. It's not always bad. Not every tension has to be resolved. Not every tension can be fixed. We shouldn't try to fix every tension. Yeah, I had somebody explain this to me one time, and I'm not a mechanic. Listen, I know how to put gas in my car. Most of the time I can figure out how to jump a battery. I can check the oil usually. But, I'm not a mechanic. I grew up in a home where my dad grew up in an orphanage. My dad's word was, hey, Jim, mechanics have to make a living too. And so we always took a car to a mechanic. And that's what I do to this day. My brother decided he wanted to learn how to work on cars. He actually took a high school course and a college course because he wanted to be able to fix his own car. Great. He can do that all he wants. I pay the mechanic. But somebody used an illustration with me one time about the serpentine belt that's almost in every vehicle now, and how it has to be in the correct tension because it goes through all the different things that are being driven by that belt. And if the tension isn't correct, the battery dies, the alternator doesn't work, the engine doesn't get cooled properly. There are all kinds of things that go wrong. There's tension that's good, folks, and there's tension in our lives that is good. We don't have to fix everything, we just have to manage it. And that's part of conflict resolution. The other point I want to make is, would you please resist suffocation? There are some marriage relationships where the people just suffocate each other. And it's really important to have friendships outside of the marriage relationship. It's really important for a husband to have male friends, the wife to have female friends, that they can talk to and share with and process with. It doesn't mean they have to reveal all their secrets or bare their hearts to those people all the time. Those intimate kind of conversations should be reserved for a husband and wife. But if you don't have some outside relationships, you end up suffocating each other, just dying for lack of oxygen, because it's become such a closed, sealed relationship. So please, whether you're married or not married yet, or thinking about getting married again, or whether you're widowed, have some kind of relationships. They're really important. Here's another one that goes along with my car stuff, right? Would you please schedule maintenance? Schedule maintenance. That's a non-negotiable. You got to schedule it. Let's face it, folks. Some of you take better care of your car than you do your marriage. And that's really bad. That's really bad. And that might include having a schedule for when you're going to be intimate with each other. Because although the world says that has to be, spontaneous, that rarely works very well. So schedule maintenance. And then the final thing on this list that, and again, this is not in any order of priority, would you please prepare to change? I've seen couples that have come to me and they've been married for 30 years and they're saying, we're getting divorced. Why? Because he changed. She changed. Well, you didn't expect him to change? Come on. Change is inevitable. We raise our kids and we want them to change. Let's face it, we want them to get potty trained. We don't want to change diapers the rest of their life. We want them to change, and we don't get frustrated when they change. Why do we get frustrated and put ourselves in paralysis because our spouse changed? We ought to change. All of us should change. I look at myself and I say, I've changed a lot. And I look at my adult children, and they've been married all the way from 8 years to 28 years. And I look at them and I say, wow, they've changed. And they continue to change. And that's a good thing. Iron sharpens iron, and sparks are going to fly, and conflict is going to happen, but prepare for the change that comes with it. And these are all truths. All of this is truth. The definition of marriage and how this all comes together, this is all stuff that we ought to impress on our children. Talk about it. Talk to them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. This kind of stuff ought to be the topic of family dinners. These kind of things ought to be the things that we talk about with our kids, with our spouses, with our adult children, with our grandchildren. They need to realize this is part of how life is woven together. Because Jesus says this, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Now hear me, folks. Hear me. There are situations where separation is necessary. I believe that as we go through our series, that we will touch on those things and you'll have a better understanding. But I just want you to know that sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it's the only choice. But it's not God's choice. He allows it because of the hardness of my heart and your heart. He allows it because of the hardness of our hearts. Now think with me for just a minute, and I'll wrap this up, but think with me for a minute. Think of how we would change in our culture if we began to have this kind of understanding about marriage. Think about how our families would change. Think about the the chain that we could break, where over and over again, generationally, children are born out of wedlock and marriages fail, and that just becomes a chain, and over again, it just continues to happen, generation after generation. Think of how we could change that if we started looking at marriage and talking about marriage and addressing conflict and figuring out how to do conflict resolution. Think of how we could change our culture's understanding. And I'm not just saying the culture out there. I mean, one of the things that breaks my heart is the rate of divorce in the church for people who claim to know Jesus is the same as people who claim they don't know Jesus. It's the same. Should that be? No, it really shouldn't. And we have a responsibility. You have a responsibility. As a household of faith, we have a responsibility to impact our culture, both inside the church and outside the church, in order to help people understand what a healthy marriage looks like. Because we don't want to be ordinary. We don't want to be like everybody else. None of you want to be like everybody else. We all want to experience the fullness of what God has for us in our lives. And that doesn't always mean that we're happy, but it does mean that we can be content. It doesn't always mean that we're going to feel like we're in love, but it means that we can do the actions that produce feelings of love. That is what we're called to do. That is who we're called to be as Jesus followers. We're called to be no ordinary family, and part of that is that we have to be fit to be tied. Next Sunday, on Mother's Day, I am overwhelmed by the acceptance of a friend of mine. Her name is Kim White. I've known Dan and Kim since 93, 94. I've watched their kids grow up. Their kids are just a little bit younger than my kids. And I've served on boards and committees with them within another denomination. They've been very active in the camp that I'm active in every Sunday or every summer for teenagers.